just thinking about, today's program, Building a Code of Ethics, it is one of the most frequent requests that we hear from our clients day to day. And it's important for a few reasons, and I just want to point this out before we dive in. First and foremost, and you guys are fully aware of this, is that there's tremendous regulatory pressure and a lot of legal requirements that we all hear. Also, too, there's a growing pressure for us to lead ethically within the industry based on our competitors. So, for instance, when there's a breach in, one pharmaceutical company, all the other pharma companies seem to all of a sudden be looking at their code of ethics programs, and that's true for all industries as well. The other thing is code of ethics gets a lot of visibility within an organization, in part because of the level of involvement that the CEO has, as well as thinking that that CEO takes the training, has a hand in the training, a lot of involvement, as well as the code of ethics training is taken by literally everyone worldwide in an organization. So clearly, code of ethics is a very hot topic, very important topic. And Mark, I'm wondering if you can just walk us through a little bit of what our attendees today could get out of today's webinar in terms of code of ethics program.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jen. So over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to walk you through a 6-step model that has come from research, primarily from Ethicus Magazine, which is the main publication of the SCCE. By the end of the session, you'll understand what is the difference between ethics versus compliance. You'll have some rules of thumb for getting your CEO on board with your ethics training program. We'll talk a little bit about getting the cadence of ethics training right, when to run a one-off session and when to weave it through your programs. Neil is going to help out with looking at some lessons from successful organizations that have been innovative in terms of how they've run their ethics training. Once it's up and running, we'll talk about how to sustain your ethics training. And then finally, the golden challenge for us in training: how do we go about measuring the program impact of ethics training? So that's what we should be covering in the next 30 minutes, Jen.
All right, sounds great. Thank you so much, Mark. Something that I want to just hit real quick, about 60 seconds, for those of you that on the call who are not familiar with Interactive Services, I just want to give you guys a quick blurb about our organization. So Interactive Services is headquartered in Dublin, Ireland. We are a design and development company that has developed custom compliance training for over 24 years. We've done code of conduct curriculums for companies across many industries, and you could see just a few of our clients on the bottom, and you could see it's from industries within financial, pharmaceutical, aviation, retail, and so forth. About a year ago, we made a decision to add an off-the-shelf offering to add to our legacy of custom programs that we've developed. We created the Interactive Compliance Training. And what this is it's an 80-plus topic library of e-learning modules that are mix and match so that you can identify the specifics for your organization. It is mobile compatible across all devices. It's customizable to meet the needs of your company. We fully integrate with LMS, and we do offer enterprise-wide licenses. So the Interactive Compliance Training can be a backbone program to creating any code of ethics curriculum that you might have. So at this point, I want to dive back in, just want to make sure everybody knew sort of who we are. But the question that you see posed is, what do we mean by ethics versus compliance? And the reason why I think this is a really critical piece to start with is those two words, ethics and compliance, are used very interchangeably. So, Mark, I'd like to ask you, what does the research out there say, and how does it define the difference between ethics and compliance?
It's certainly an interesting one. Neil, you might just want to move on to the next slide for us here. The terms ethics and compliance, they get used interchangeably. Some organizations have a chief ethics officer, some organizations have a chief compliance officer, and some organizations have both. In reality, you might want to think of compliance as being what we are required to do by law. So compliance is what we're mandated to do based upon the legal framework. On the other hand, ethics focuses more on what we ought to do regardless of the situation. So ethics comes down more to personal judgment, values, thinking for yourself. When we look at that, what it means for the individual and the organization, you'll see there on the right, if you take the individual, compliance is more about judgment, decision-making skills to follow and stay compliant with a particular piece of legislation. At an organizational level, it reflects itself in the policies, practices, and procedures. When we move into that left-hand column, which really reflects integrity, ethics, this comes down to personal character for the individual. But as an organization, it really reflects itself in the values, traditions, and leadership within that firm. So I think when you approach compliance training and ethics training, it's clear to differentiate between the two. Do you want to just teach the baseline, which is mandated by law, or do you want to go further and say this is what we stand for as an organization? Hopefully that gives a short description. I think we could fill a whole semester at business school debating those two, but at a high level, hopefully it covers it.
No, thank you, Mark. That's perfect, actually. Gives us a nice foundation. So the next thing, what we'd like to talk about is what happens when people do not do what Mark just described. When people don't abide by the code of ethics, the cost of a breach is tremendous. In fact, the typical organization loses 5% of revenue to fraud each and every year. Now, just to be really transparent, what that really equates to is if you thought of, $1 billion, 5% of that is $50 million. That's a massive impact. And that bottom line becomes so crucial to a CEO, which is why it's imperative that the culture of compliance starts absolutely at the top with the CEO. Neil, if you want to flip one more. Starting at the top with the CEO is going to be very important, and we're going to describe to you a little bit more of what that means and some action steps of what can happen. But there's a statistic I want to share with you that you might be a little bit surprised of. The SEC cited a company's SEO and or their SFO for some level of involvement in 89% of the fraud cases that were studied. Mark, can you share some insight into that for us so that we can understand that a little bit more?
I can, and on some level it is an attention grabber for a presentation like this. I mean, I would qualify it by saying that C-level fraud is very much the exception, and if it does happen, it's unlikely that your e-learning and training programs are going to stop it. But on the flip side of it, it does show what happens when ethical behavior doesn't happen right at the top of an organization. The impact can be catastrophic and can lead right through to an SEC or federal investigation. Let's look at something a little bit more positive. You'll see this on the next slide here. When we think about designing a code of ethics training, a key individual to get on board is the CEO within your firm. Here are a few ideas to walk through that we've seen from research out there in the industry. The first is your CEO should be the first person to take your compliance training, and it should be the individual going through it rather than his or her admin. We'd also encourage your CEO to get on the phone, try your hotline services, and really be aware of what is being offered to employees within the business for keeping an ethical environment. There's a big emphasis on featuring the CEO and other C-level leaders within learning, especially in online programs, but our opinion is scripted videos are not enough. Those messages don't resonate with employees. Instead, think about speeches that are off the cuff, have candor, and perhaps more importantly, how can you bring those to in-person events? So what happens at your annual meeting, what happens when your CEO speaks throughout the year is just as important as, probably more important than a scripted message delivered using a teleprompter. The next one is ethics does lend itself to big inspirational words, but that they often fall flat and don't have a lot of meaning. Instead, focus on real success stories from the business rather than just empty messaging. Another piece to think about is feedback. So it is quite common to survey employees each year on the state of ethics within the business. Ideally, that feedback should be fed into your CEO, and it should be reflected in his or her communication in the firm and also in the training programs that your employees go through. You want to give a clear message that ethics is something that involves and that listening is happening right at the top of the organization. Final insight, think about your future leaders. It's not just the CEO. Ethics should be the foundation of any leadership programs that you run within your organization. Just a nice learning activity to wrap up this particular slide with. You could give this to your CEO, you could give it to your board, you could give it as part of an ethics classroom training, but a nice activity that I came across was asking participants to write a speech about ethics in your organization, here's the caveat, without using the words ethics or values as part of that statement. It gets quite interesting. There's a lot of inspirational languages, but by doing this, it really does get people to focus on what are the nuts and bolts, what happens on a day-to-day level in terms of making ethics a part of the company's culture.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So it's pretty clear from what Mark just described that a culture of compliance starts at the top. And now when we think about application, we want to think about how to weave it into the training. And there's been a lot of buzz about how important that is to do that. So Mark, what's some of the rules of thumb as to how to weave ethics into your training?
Well, approaching this presentation, like a lot of learning professionals, I always thought weaving ethics into a overall curriculum was the way to go. But in reality, when we looked in this a little bit deeper, there are certain instances where weaving ethics and compliance makes sense, and there are other instances where running a one-time ethics class will be of more value. And you'll see there on the left are recommendations as to when you should use weaving, and on the right there, when you'll get more benefit from a one-time class. Let's just run through and do a little bit of comparison. If you're teaching subjects that are relevant to ethics, such as pharmaceutical sales, corporate sourcing, there's a lot of opportunities as part of those classes to teach ethics. If you're teaching a more factual subject, such as engineering or pole climbing, other than don't push your colleague off the pole, the opportunities to weave ethics into that class are going to be quite limited, and therefore you're probably better off teaching it as a separate subject. Also think about the education culture you have within your firm. If you run lots of training, it's probably a good opportunity to weave ethics. If training happens infrequently within your business, it probably is going to be better to schedule that one-off class. Another great rule of thumb is this concept of weaving ethics tends to work best for your general population within the audience. Once you get into individuals that have been tasked with building a culture of ethics within your organizations, managers, people that have been put forward for this role, they will benefit from an individual class dedicated just to ethics. Finally, let's just talk about some of the risks. When you weave compliance or ethics, the risk you run is that that message gets lost in your overall program. So if you're weaving it, you really have to make sure that it doesn't just fall by the wayside and gets lost with your overall message. The flip side is if you run a one-time class, the risk is that ethics becomes an activity in window dressing. We did a class once a year for 1 hour. It doesn't really mean anything. So if you're going for the route of one-time classes, just beware of the risk of it being seen as window dressing. In reality, like in many instances, you likely want a combination of those two, using both weaving and one-time ethics classes. So just a quick warm-up around how would you go about teaching ethics. An activity that we saw here, you could do this online, you could also do it in a classroom setting, you could do it as part of a managed discussion, asking participants to think about where do they draw the line. If you ask people, are you ethical? I think most of us would say on the phone here, yes, I am ethical, but it very much is a grey area. So where do you draw the line with gifts? Is it a free pen, a lunch, baseball tickets, rugby tickets if we're back in Ireland, or paid plane tickets? It's a great one to get people to think about their own personal values, how they fit within the organization, and also is a great way for starting a dialogue. Jen, back to you.
Thank you for that. So I think where we're at right now is to think about, the application, and the best way in which to share some is to give specific case examples so we can see what it looks like in the real world. So we've taken 3 case studies from Ethicos Magazine, which is one of the leading journals of ethics. And what we're going to do is turn this over to Neil, who will share the first one from GE, and then Mark will share one, and then from Coors Brewing Company, and Neil will round us up with the last one from Lockheed Martin. So Neil, I'll share this over to you.
Excellent, thanks Jen. And yes, these case studies are taken from Ethicos Magazine. It's published by the Society for Corporate Compliance and Ethics. Really useful and really insightful magazine for case studies, ideas around training, so I would highly recommend that you check that one out. So the first example here is from GE, who in the 80s had a marketing manager internally that they called, or that was known as Mr. Israel. So this particular colleague had a lot of high-level contacts within the Israeli government and colluded around the development of some fighter jet engine test cells that were never actually built, and instead the money was diverted into some Swiss bank accounts. And not the most ethical behavior there. How they got away with that was that the marketing manager in question, he intimidated and essentially bullied some colleagues into signing off on the initial documents. And then when it came to getting the second signatures on those documents, once people saw that a first person had signed off, they were happy to be the second signature without necessarily going and doing some back checking to make sure that everything was legitimate. Once they saw that another colleague had signed off, they were happy to put their name to that as well. Ultimately, what happened was that 21 people lost their jobs. The CEO at the time was hauled before a Congress committee. And as a training intervention to that, what GE decided to do was to be upfront with their employees with what had happened. So say, this happened in the business. This is something that we don't want to happen in future. So, let's all use this as a learning experience. And they partnered with NBC to create a real-life video, not a fictitious case study. The employees were very appreciative of being treated as adults and being told, this is something that impacts us all. This is something that we all need to take seriously. And I think really the lesson here from a code of ethics training point of view is, weaving in real-life examples, stories from the business that you can tell is really impactful. And obviously in this instance, it was something that was high budget. They partnered with NBC to create those videos, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case all of the time. If you're using a training program, whether that be developed internally or using an external provider, it could be a one-screen summary of a story from the business that you want to share with learners. It could be one scenario that uses a real-life case study from the business, and using those real-life stories can really have a big impact when it comes to the code of ethics training. Mark, do you want to take over on CORS?
Absolutely, would love to. I think this is a very interesting scenario. So CORS Brewing Company, they had their code of ethics rewritten by an attorney, and certainly no offense to any attorneys on the phone here, but the policy that came out of it, their code of ethics, was very reflective of what you might expect to a document that's been written by someone with a pure legal background. And what they elected to do was print off the new code of ethics and mail it to every employee's home address. It wasn't distributed in the office, it was mailed to the home address. And much like you might get in high school, there was a tear and sign sheet for people to confirm that they were adhere to the new policy. What's interesting was the outcome of that was not only did 30% of employees not complete it, they actually went a step further and outright refused to sign the document. And I think the most telling breakdown in this particular instances was no training around the new code of ethics was given ahead of distributing the legal document. So the training department came in and they did a fabulous job of remediating this situation, and they elected to move to building an online learning program, which I think has some great insights, which we apply in the training that we build ourselves for our own clients. First up, they used role profiling, but they kept it really simple. They broke the organization down into 3 functional groups. This allowed them to offer relevant code of ethics examples without getting overly complex or expensive by having a higher level of profiling. They took a brave step and they elected to get rid of scoring. So rather than scoring, they focused instead on the learning experience. The electronic policy affirmation went from being that tear and sign sheet to being integrated within the training, and they got rid of the legalese. They asked a simple question: do you agree to uphold our code? When they went to rolling out this piece of training, they used a tiered model. First of all, they put their most senior management through, their board. Next, it went out to every salaried employee, and finally they reached out to the line workers within the business. I think the most telling insight that they learned from the training remediation was they ran focus groups before they launched ethics. Ethics is a sensitive subject. It impacts our values. When they ran the training, they found that it was too much of a broadcast model. There wasn't enough interaction. There wasn't an opportunity for employees to reflect. So they went back to the drawing board, applied a few tweaks, and made the program more interactive before rolling it out to the overall business. I think focus groups prior to the launch were critical as to why that one was a success. Jen, do you want us to finish off with the third case study or keep moving?
You know what? I think we'll do that. I think it's a valuable one, so we'll go ahead and I'll have Neil do Lockheed Martin.
Yep, and it's a pretty short one, but it's simple and it's a good idea. So Lockheed Martin, they had a top-down approach when it came to their code of ethics training and their code of ethics awareness programs, and they wanted to get more employees involved in that process and build up a bit of a grassroots movement. So essentially what they did was two things. They ran a challenge initially for employees to create a compliance poster or an ethics poster, and to submit that to the compliance department and the compliance office, and that it would be used as one of the campaign elements in Lockheed Martin's ethics awareness program from the following year. When they did that, it was extremely successful. They got a lot of input from employees, so they decided to expand that out, and they challenged employees to create a 2-minute video that would highlight an ethical scenario or an ethical situation. And again, that was used as part of the training and as part of the ethics awareness. There was a prize for the best video along with a few honorable mentions, but the prize was essentially for the creators of that video, and it could have been an individual employee, it could have been a team, it could have been people from the same department or an office, one of their global offices, but essentially the prize was to attend the annual meeting of ethics officers within the organization in Orlando. And then it also tied in with a chairman's award for ethics, which in the year that this case study was written was awarded to a Lockheed Martin salesperson who was approached by a government official for a bribe, didn't take the bribe, reported the situation immediately, and was rewarded for their ethical behavior in that instance. So again, the takeaway is to where you do see an opportunity for involving employees in the Code of Ethics program. Definitely it's a good idea to do that, and it can be something as simple as running a little challenge or running a competition for, designing a poster or putting a little video together, which could easily be shot on a cell phone device or a tablet device. Everybody has those devices to hand, so it's something that's very easily done.
Thank you so much for that, Neil. I think each of these three examples were very different, but again, all surrounding the exact same thing, which is the code of ethics. And I think that the important thing is that regardless of how great you develop your training, how great you develop your one-offs that you do, it's not going to sustain unless you find a way in which to replicate, to reinforce, to sustain that culture of ethics. It can't be just something that's one and done. So it's really important, and we're going to talk about that in terms of how to establish and sustain that culture of ethics. Peter Drucker, who is described as the founder of modern management, said, in fact, that culture eats strategy for lunch. And I think that that's so important, because many times we talk so much about the strategies, the things that we do, without really thinking about, how to really develop that sustainment of culture, and that it's not something that just checks the box or that's one and done. So, Mark, what are some ways that we can ensure that a culture of compliance is developed?
I'll try my best here. This is quite a tricky question to answer, but here are some insights that we found when researching this topic. I think the first to start out with is ethical business should be the norm, not the exception. You certainly don't be paying bonuses to employees for ethical behavior. In reality, that should be the baseline, the minimum of what you expect from an employee. Another point to consider is when ethical breaches happen, and the most high-profile one is inflating earnings reports to meet Wall Street expectations. They make future ethical breaches more likely to happen in the future. There's pressure to keep up the line. If I lie about my earnings statements in Q1, the bar only rises higher and higher in Q2, and I'm pushed more and more to keep up with the lies that I've told in the past. Okay, so how do we go about creating, sustaining that culture of ethics? And I'll look here at some tactics from in the business, and then Jen will walk us through what this means for training. The first is beware of sacred cows. When things go wrong, you have to look at the instance itself rather than looking at the entire career. Even if somebody's been with your business for 20 years, if they're found guilty of theft within the organization, you have to look at that individual instance rather than what they've done in the past. These things, they spread within an organization, they become source of rumors, and they really do infect the culture of the organization. So I think the message over there is avoid cover-ups. This stuff will get out, so it's better to be transparent about it. Think about sustaining a culture of accountability. An interesting statistic here, over 50% of ethics violations came to light not from audits, not from key controls, but from individual employees acting as whistleblowers. So you can't codify to protect your organization. In reality, you need to rely on individual employees working within a culture of accountability at your organization. And I think to back that up, you want to think about the culture of candor. It's okay to talk about ethics. It's okay to talk about the gray areas. It's also okay to talk about when things go wrong. When things do go wrong, take decisive disciplinary action that is fair and happens quickly. And then finally, think about the day-to-day actions of your CEO. And again, what you see in a scripted video message at the beginning of an e-learning course probably isn't going to have that much more weight. In terms of how your CEO acts on a day-to-day basis, right down to, do they have lunch in your canteen? How do they interact and treat employees on a day-to-day basis? Those are the things that really build culture within an organization. If I had to summarize all of it, I would say, to bring it all together, how decisions get made in your company is just as important as the content of that decision making. Jen, do you want to talk about what that means from a training perspective?
Definitely. So one of the things that a lot of times people think of is that, if you just develop the training, then you've, hit your regulatory check the box kind of a thing. But I think the most important thing is that we surround a campaign, an awareness, a communication, almost a marketing plan, if you will, surrounding that training. So for instance, a kickoff campaign that might include an email, so that you're literally emailing and, bringing that buzz and awareness to the entire workforce in advance of the training. The other thing that that you could add is an internet banner ad, so that you're literally placing some sort of notice or notification right on your internal website. Video boosters are another great way, so that you have short little snippets that are sent out and distributed to your workforce, almost like a TED Talk, if you will, that it might be a key leader in the company or some sort of message to just, again, sustain and reinforce throughout that calendar year. Infographic job aids are another great thing, so that people have a desk reference, so that they have that ability to support them in the moment when things are actually happening, that's long after when the training has occurred. And the last thing is being updated as laws change, policies, procedures, regulatory requirements change and adjust throughout the calendar year to ensure that your staff and your workforce are always updated and communication stays consistent. And all of those things are great ways to really sustain that culture of ethics throughout and embedded in your training. This really brings us to the next and last part, which is, of course, the program effectiveness and assessing, do people truly understand? This is the part that regulators really take a look at. Want to make sure that people have taken it, that they've scored properly, that they know the information. Mark, what are some tips and ideas surrounding program effectiveness and what we could do in terms of training?
It is. I mean, this is the big challenge within the training industry overall. It's filled training conferences for the past 10 years. How do we measure the effectiveness of training? Even before you begin to look at the subtleties of how do you begin to measure the effectiveness of ethics training. And unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. But I wanted to share a methodology that I came across from Xerox. I think they ran a very nice program which is simple and goes a long way to starting a foundation. So the methodology that they ran was they elected to survey their global business. They did it on a rotating business by region, business unit, and function. And that meant every 24 months or 2 years, every employee within the business had participated within the survey. The information that they collected was anonymous. This allowed them to track by country, but they couldn't tie back data to individual cities or offices, so you can't compare the ethical behavior of your Chicago office versus New York. Interestingly, what the team at Xerox said was the most useful insight they got from the survey was when folks came back and said, I don't know. It gave an insight in terms of where they need to focus the training and where there were gray areas in the business that could be addressed. So the survey itself was really simple, 5 questions. First up, have you witnessed unethical conduct at any time in the past 12 months? Next, are you aware that your company has a helpline? And it's a question I would love to ask in a lot of organizations. So simple, something we take for granted, but in reality, a lot of employees may not even be aware. Are you comfortable with the way helpline calls are being handled? What do you think of the ethical environment in our company, and is discipline appropriate? So they give a great feedback in terms of what is the baseline knowledge of employees, but the things that they were really looking for was variation between different geographic regions, and more importantly, what was trending over time. They essentially gave them a feedback loop for their overall ethics program, but more importantly, it allowed them to feedback into their code of ethics training. Jen, that's going to wrap up quite a big monologue there. It would make me no harm just to run through the 6 points that we covered off on, as we did cover a lot of material today.
Definitely. Just to sort of reflect and summarize everything that Mark, Neil, and myself have talked about today, the first thing we did was identify the difference between personal ethics and corporate compliance, and we talked about key factors for role integrity and judgment and how that plays into our training. Next, we took a look at the importance of a top-down approach and ensuring that the CEO is on board and that their leadership really showcases almost the example and the role model. We also addressed the rules of thumb with frequency of a one-time training versus a curriculum-type training and how to weave it in and how not to or when not to. The other thing we talked about, and Neil and Mark did a fantastic job to walk us through 3 specific case studies of how successful organizations really build code of ethics programs and how differently it looks. We also discussed elements of sustainment and how compliance must be embedded as a culture, and also how communication and awareness campaigns can really help leverage that, and that training for compliance isn't just one and done. It's something that needs to happen throughout the calendar year. And lastly, Mark talked about assessment, diagnostics, and the attestation to help measure your program's impact and ensure that your workforce really knows, understands, and agrees to abide by that. So hopefully you've found these key steps for improving your code of ethics in 2017 to be valuable. What I'd like to do is open it up to the questions. So if you haven't yet put your question in the chat bar, make sure that you do that now. And Neil, what questions have come through at this point?
Yeah, so the first question we had from another Jen, which was around courses that focus on specific regulations. So say, for example, the Sunshine Act, and what is an appropriate training cadence for such courses? So is it annually? Is it every 2 years? Is it twice a year? And if you have any thoughts around that.
Definitely. So the Sunshine Act is something that's very specific to pharmaceutical and healthcare industries. So one of the things to think about is that for new employees that come in, they're going to need that training in its entirety. For other employees that are tenured, it will be important to still have that annual training, and then perhaps every other year you could do a diagnostic testing, which is something that Mark just talked about at the very end. So for instance, they could test down instead of them taking that 40-minute course. What you could do is put an assessment on the front end. If they get 100%, then they would test out, or if they got, say, an 80 or a 70, they would test down and only be required to actually take the portions of the e-learning that they didn't know and weren't familiar with. Okay, excellent question, though. Thank you for that. Any other questions come in?
Yeah, another one from Tom, which in some ways does follow on from that. But overall, for a global code of ethics training, how long should that training be typically?
I think there are no clear benchmarks at the moment. The regulators haven't made an opinion, but what we've seen to be the most effective with clients that we work with is up to 2 hours of code of ethics and compliance training for new hires in their first 90 days, up to 2 hours in the first 90 days. And then I think for existing employees, unless you're moving to a new code, anywhere from 20 up to 40 minutes would be applicable depending upon what the emphasis is that year and how much focus you need to place on ethics.
Okay, and then we've got another one. It relates to getting stakeholder involvement in the code of ethics training. So Mark, you touched on getting the CEO involved, but typically how many stakeholders should be involved in developing that code of ethics training and getting all that content together and making sure it's right?
Certainly, I mean, it's a tricky one. We've done this before with several institutions. Typically for code of ethics, we find that there are a broad group of stakeholders. It's not uncommon for you to have up to 30 subject matter experts who are participating in designing a program like this. You have to give them a seat at the table, otherwise they're not going to accept the outcome of the training project. But beyond that broad group of 30 stakeholders, I would recommend having a working group of 6 folks that set the direction, and then you want to have 1, possibly 2 people who lead the overall project management of the initiative.
Thanks, Mark. And then just a final one for now. I know we're getting up on time, so getting the balance right between global programs and country-specific programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen work best out there is we should have 1 global code of ethics program. So if I get hired in the UK in a call center, I get exposed to the same baseline program as somebody who is working in senior management in Argentina. Beyond that, you may want to run regional programs depending upon particular risks or issues that are dominant in that country. But the benefit of having that global baseline code of ethics program is, beyond everyone having a common knowledge of what the firm stands for, it makes it easier to maintain your content on a year-to-year basis, and it also makes managing localization into frequently 10, 20-plus languages a lot more manageable. Jen, why don't we wrap up there, Neil? Jen, do you want to just talk about some of the things that we can that'll be happening from after this presentation?
Definitely. So first of all, if anybody has additional questions that were not answered, feel free to reach out to any of us and we could certainly follow up with you. We, in fact, will reach out to all of the people that were on today's call and send you a PDF of today's PowerPoint presentation. But wanted to just say this, especially as we are in the last quarter of the calendar year, looking forward to 2017, a lot of people are looking at their compliance training for 2017. And there's a few different ways that we can help you out. One is that we can share with you ethics training programs that we've already built. And those are 2 different kinds of thinking. One would be for an existing program for your existing employees, or also for new hire code of ethics programs. So we can take a look at that. Also, too, we could audit your ethics and compliance training and really help you to create a learner journey to figure out what you already have, what potential gaps you might have, and to figure out how we can really help to supplement that. So if you're in that position on either side and you'd like to explore that, feel free to reach out, and Mark, Neil, and myself would love to help you out with that. So on behalf of the 3 of us and Interactive Compliance Training, we just want to say thank you for taking the time today, and we look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.